Let's get a word on all the big stories of the day. Eliot Wilson is joining us, former clerk at the House of Commons, now commentator on the day's news. Good afternoon to you, Eliot. Nice to have you with us again. Let's start with PMQs. This, of course, comes around after angry unions warn of fresh strikes after Labour ministers recommend offensive 2.8% pay rises for teachers, NHS staff and civil servants. And, of course, that is precisely the fodder of the argument, I suppose, between the left and the right, if that makes sense.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because one of the problems with the debate about particularly public sector pay is that we've kind of come to see trade unions as a sort of neutral or sort of authoritative figure. They're one side in a dispute, and they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do for their members, which is argue as hard as they can for as good a settlement as they can. But I think they set themselves up as a slightly sort of moral authority by talking about pay rises as being offensive. I think people in the private sector who may not have a pay rise at all, who may be suffering from below inflation pay decreases, are going to find that quite difficult to handle and to accept. And I think the idea that you're setting out then to disrupt ordinary people's lives as much as possible in the run-up to Christmas makes it even more difficult.
And I don't know the way around this, of course, because, you know, unions, we played a little clip of Mick Lynch earlier. You know, he's right up there with the old kind of, you know, it's almost like somebody opened a packet of union leaders. They seem to have this incredible way of sounding fairly similar, and even on odd occasions, it's like looking fairly similar as well. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but nonetheless, the point is they were looking forward to a Labour government because they felt that a Labour government would be more understanding of their plight. And previously, lots of Labour politicians have made no secret of the fact they're also union people. I'm thinking of Angela Rayner and people like that. It's in their blood. It's fine. We're not North Korea. It's a democracy. You're allowed to have whatever position you like. But, of course, once you get into power, everything changes a little bit, doesn't it? It becomes a very different negotiating position.
It does. And I mean, some public sector unions particularly have seen benefits from the new government with, you know, very early agreed and quite substantial pay settlements, particularly in the NHS and in education. But I think the government is trying, on the one hand, to say that effectively there is no money for anything. And, you know, Rachel Reeves talking about this iron fist against waste, whatever that exactly means. And at the same time, they're trying to argue that giving substantial pay settlements to major sectors of the economy is somehow doing the right thing and also doing the necessary thing. And I don't think they've quite got their messaging aligned on that. And I think, as I say, you know, people who are not union members, not members of large unions, and union membership has decreased substantially over the past 20, 30 years, don't really find this as easy a way of dealing with things to understand as perhaps once they did. Yeah,
indeed. Well, it's going to be interesting. I mean, this strike, this Christmas, Avanti West Coast strike could be called off, and of course they are hopeful it will be. But if it isn't, it's going to cause absolute chaos, because the days, as with all of these strikes, are always planned rather meticulously to create maximum havoc, I think.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the union wants to create as much difficulty and inconvenience as possible, because that, in its view, will give it more leverage over the government. But, you know, inevitably, the victim here is the ordinary travelling member of the public. And I think people also look at, particularly with rail unions, people look at the jobs that are being talked about and think that they're not, you know, ludicrously badly paid in some cases. And also, you know, rail unions in particular do have something of a history of dying in the ditch for what seem like very outdated practices. You know, whether it's maintaining 2 drivers on trains that really don't need 2 drivers, whether it's, you know, maintaining staffing levels which have been for historic rather than practical reasons. They do have that legacy behind them. And I think if you're not a union member, if you're just trying to get home for Christmas, or if you've got relatives trying to come for Christmas, you look at people objecting about only being paid, you know, in some cases £40,000 or more a year for jobs that seem relatively secure and safe. And I don't think you have a great deal of sympathy necessarily for people saying that they are being insulted by small pay increases.
Let's move to this story as well. This is interesting. You spent a long time as a clerk in the House of Commons. You know the territory backwards. You know the rule book backwards. Do you ever get tested on that? I always think like a sommelier or something. You know, who can sniff out a wine? You know, if somebody says, paragraph 7 of this act or that law or that rule, and what a honourable member is or isn't allowed to say. I mean, you've got to have your wits about you when you're doing that job. But of course, the one thing that doesn't come up are the other rules around Parliament, and that is things like, can an MP have a second job? It's nothing to do with the chamber itself, but these are big areas of concern. And can their spouses have jobs with them, which is another area that's come to light again, not for the first time, as you'll be aware. Rachel Reeves, Pat McFadden, Wes Streeting all have spouses or relatives on the taxpayer or the Labour Party payroll. You'll be familiar, Eliot, with that argument. Should you be allowed to employ your wife or your son or your daughter?
Well, I mean, there are a number of different roles being talked about here. And for a long time, of course, as people know, a lot of MPs employed family members to run their constituency office or to run their parliamentary office, partly because it was, they said, somebody they knew and somebody they could work closely with, and partly also because it gave the family an extra income. And that's a debate we've long had. It's now very much more difficult to do that. Mostly you can't now employ family members unless they were on sort of legacy contracts agreed previously. But there's a fundamental scenario, which is that the political community, the sort of Westminster village, is really very small. And so you do get relationships forming between people. For example, I mean, Rachel Reeves is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Her husband, Nick Joycey, is a senior official. I think he's a Director General at DEFRA, the Department of the Environment.
Yes. Yeah.
These are people who move in similar circles, who meet each other in various scenarios, and inevitably some of them do form romantic and spousal relationships, and then they have children. And of course, Rachel Reeves' sister happens to be in the cabinet with her. Her husband is Lord Cryer, who is a government whip in the House of Lords and a former Labour MP. And I think the fundamental question, because people looking from the outside do think this is all a bit weird. There's no question about that. We have to remember that. The fundamental question is, do any of these people have these jobs because of these family connections? Are they benefiting from them? Or are they simply a sort of quirk of, isn't that interesting? These two people who work in very similar industries or positions know each other and are married to each other. And I think, although I'm not persuaded that there is a huge issue around actual corruption, I do think that the perception issue is enormously important, because we know how low trust is in politics. And there is an extent to which politicians have to hold their hands up and say, look, we have to not only be clean and lacking in corruption and straight, we need to show the public that we are. And there is definitely a job of work to do there in saying to the public, look, these are people appointed through open competition, no question of any corruption, graft, hidden influence. This is all legit and above board. And politicians and the civil service and the political community in general does, I think, need to go that extra mile in saying, we understand this looks weird. It may be fine in our view, but this is why it's fine, and this is why it's got to the situation where it is. Yeah,
I remember talking to Roger Gale about this years ago. His wife, Susie, was alongside him forever, and, he made the not unreasonable point. Well, it makes perfect sense, as a constituency MP, having your wife do your diary, all your books, the admin that goes with it, it's almost a no-brainer that you would have your wife there. I don't think he was doing it so that she could, trouser an extra few quid on the family payroll. It did genuinely, in that case, make sense.
And if we think about, perhaps it happens less these days, but if you think about, independent small traders or private enterprises, often you will have one half of a couple who is the professional, a plumber or a builder or whatever, and their other half may do the accounts or something like that. It's not something that's impossible to get your head around, but I think the public service, the public sphere has become such regarded in so poor a way that it does require more explanation and defence now.
Indeed. Listen, great to have you with us again, Eliot Wilson, former clerk at the House of Commons.